Unfortunately, it comes to our final song for ever. I just want to say to you on behalf of the guys in Black Sabbath and myself, that your support over the years has made it all possible for us to live a lifestyle we live. Thank you from the bottom of our heart. I love you, we love you.
I found out from my kids, they kept trying to get me up really early in the morning, texting and calling, and I thought it was fake news. But the images that I got...
Two old friends, partners in creating some of the heaviest music the world has ever heard, sharing their final moments together. One of them is tired, struggling with illness, but still pushing through to say goodbye. The other is watching his best friend and musical brother slowly slip away. What would you say in those final moments? What words would carry the weight of a friendship that changed music forever? Just over a week ago, the world lost one of its greatest rock legends. Ozzy Osbourne, the Prince of Darkness himself, passed away at age 76, leaving behind a legacy that stretches far beyond music. But before we talk about his death, we need to talk about his life, his friendship with Tony Iommi, and the heartbreaking final words that passed between these two men who gave birth to heavy metal. The story begins in Birmingham, England, back in the late 1960s. Four working-class kids got together and accidentally created something that would change music forever. Tony Iommi was the guitarist with the missing fingertips. Geezer Butler was the bass player with the dark imagination. Bill Ward was the drummer with the thunderous beat. And then there was Ozzy Osbourne, the wild-haired singer who could scream like no one else on earth. They called themselves Black Sabbath, and they created heavy metal. But this isn't just a story about a band. This is a story about friendship, about two men who stuck together through decades of ups and downs, fights and makeups, success and failure. Tony Iommi and Ozzy Osbourne were more than bandmates. They were brothers, even when they drove each other crazy. Their friendship wasn't always easy. Like any long relationship, it had its rocky moments. Ozzy got kicked out of Black Sabbath in 1979 because his drinking and drug use had gotten so bad that the band couldn't function anymore. Can you imagine? The man who helped create Heavy Me, Tal, was told he couldn't be part of his own band anymore. It must have been devastating for everyone involved, especially Tony and Ozzy. But here's the beautiful thing about real friendship. It survives even the worst storms. Over the years, Ozzy and Tony found their way back to each other again and again. They reunited for tours and albums. They put aside their differences because the music they created together was bigger than any personal problems they might have had. Tony Iommi was always the steady one in the relationship, while Ozzy was the wild showman, the one who bit the heads off bats and doves. Tony was the quiet genius behind the guitar. He was the one who came up with those heavy, dark riffs that made Black Sabbath sound like nothing anyone had ever heard before. But more than that, he was often the one who looked out for Ozzy, who tried to keep him grounded when the fame and the substances threatened to pull him away completely. As the years went by, both men got older. Tony dealt with his own health problems, including a battle with cancer, but it was Ozzy who seemed to struggle more with the effects of time and his past lifestyle choices. The years of hard living had taken their toll on his body. In recent years, he had been dealing with Parkinson's disease, a condition that made it harder and harder for him to move and perform the way he used to. Despite his health problems, Ozzy kept trying to perform. Music wasn't just his job. It was his life, his identity, his reason for being. And Tony understood that better than anyone. They had been making music together for over 50 years. They had seen each other at their best and their worst. They had created songs that millions of people around the world considered some of the greatest rock songs ever written. Earlier this year, Black Sabbath played what would turn out to be their final show together. It was called Back to the Beginning, and it took place in Birmingham, their hometown, the place where it all started. For Ozzy, this show was incredibly important. He knew his health was failing, and he wanted to say goodbye properly, not just to his fans, but to the band that had been his life for so many decades. but the show was also heartbreaking to watch for those who knew Ozzy well. The man who used to run around the stage like a wild animal, who used to climb on stage equipment and interact with every single person in the audience, had to perform most of the show sitting down on a throne. His body just couldn't support him for a full concert anymore. Tony Iommi later talked about how difficult this was for Ozzy. He said that Ozzy was both moved and frustrated during that final show. Ozzy wanted to stand up and perform the way he always had, but his body wouldn't let him. Can you imagine how that must have felt? To have all that energy and passion trapped inside a body that could no longer express it the way it used to? The day before that final show, Ozzy sent Tony a text message. It was simple, but it revealed so much about how he was feeling. He told Tony that he was tired and low on energy. This wasn't usual pre-show jitters or normal tiredness. This was something deeper, something that spoke to how much Ozzy was struggling just to get through each day. Tony and the rest of the band knew how hard things were for Ozzy. They had started limiting his rehearsal time because they could see how much it took out of him. They would bring him in for shorter periods, let him sit down and sing, and try to make things as easy as possible for him. It was their way of taking care of their friend, of making sure he could still do what he loved without pushing himself too hard. After that final performance, after the crowd had gone home and the stage lights had been turned off, Ozzy and Tony had a quiet moment together. It was just the two of them. Two old friends who had been through everything together. And that's when Ozzy said the words that would haunt Tony forever after. Looking at his oldest friend and musical partner, Ozzy simply said, "It went all right, didn't it?" Those 6 words might seem simple, but they carried the weight of an entire lifetime. They weren't just talking about that one show, they were talking about everything. The whole journey. The 50-plus years of making music together, the fights and the makeups, the success and the struggles, the times when they were on top of the world and the times when everything seemed to be falling apart. It went all right, didn't it? With those words, Ozzy was asking Tony to confirm that their life together, their friendship, their music, had been worth it. He was asking for reassurance that despite all the problems, despite all the chaos, despite all the pain, they had created something beautiful and lasting together. Tony later said that this show was really about saying goodbye, not just to the fans, but to each other. They both knew that this was probably the end. Ozzy's health was getting worse, and it was becoming clear that he might not have much time left. This was their chance to say goodbye properly, to end their musical partnership on their own terms. Less than a month after that final show, Ozzy was gone. On July 22, 2025, the Prince of Darkness passed away at his home, surrounded by his family. The cause of death wasn't immediately released, but everyone who knew him understood that his body had finally given up after years of fighting various health problems. Tony Iommi's reaction to losing his oldest friend was heartbreaking to witness. In a statement he released shortly after Ozzy's death, Tony wrote about how shocked he was, even though they all knew this day might come soon. He said that when he heard the news, it seemed unreal, almost surreal. How do you process losing someone who has been such a huge part of your life for so many decades? Tony talked about how he believed Ozzy had held on just long enough to do that final show. It was like Ozzy's body knew he needed to say goodbye properly, needed to give his fans and his bandmates one last moment together. And maybe, in some way, those final words to Tony were Ozzy's way of making sure that Tony knew their friendship and their music had meant everything to him. The relationship between Tony Iommi and Ozzy Osbourne shows us something beautiful about human connection. These weren't perfect people. They made mistakes. They hurt it. Sometimes they struggled with their own demons. But through all of that, they maintained a bond that lasted over 50 years. They created music that touched millions of lives and changed the course of rock and roll forever. When Tony looks back on those final words now, he probably hears so much more than just, It went all right, didn't it? He probably hears all the things Ozzy couldn't say directly. Thank you for sticking with me. Thank you for believing in the music even when I couldn't believe in myself. Thank you for being my friend through everything. Thank you for helping me create something that will last long after we're both gone. Their story reminds us that the most important relationships in our lives aren't always the easiest ones. Sometimes the people who mean the most to us are the ones who challenge us, who push us to be better, who stick around even when things get difficult. Tony and Ozzy had that kind of relationship. They were creative partners, they were business associates, but most importantly, they were friends. The music that Tony Iommi and Ozzy Osbourne created together will live on long after both of them are gone. Songs like Iron Man, Paranoid, War Pigs, and Sweet Leaf will continue to inspire new generations of musicians and fans, but for those of us who love their music, knowing about those final words between two old friends makes their legacy even more meaningful. It went all right, didn't it? Yes, Ozzy, it went more than all right. You and Tony created something magical together. You gave the world heavy metal. You showed us that music could be dark and beautiful at the same time. You proved that friendship could survive anything if it's strong enough and real enough. The bond between Tony Iommi and Ozzy Osbourne teaches us about loyalty, about creativity, about the power of music to connect people across decades and differences. Their friendship wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it produced some of the most influential music in rock history. As Tony continues on without his oldest friend and musical partner, he carries with him not just the memory of those final words, but the memory of everything they built together. Every time someone picks up a guitar and plays a heavy metal riff, every time a singer screams into a microphone with passion and power, every time a band takes the stage and plays music that comes from their hearts and souls, the legacy of Tony Iommi and Ozzy Osbourne lives on. Their story reminds us to appreciate the people in our lives who truly understand us, who share our passions, who stick with us through good times and bad. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful words are the simplest ones, spoken between people who have shared a lifetime of experiences. It went all right, didn't it? Yes, it did, Ozzy. It went beautifully. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, please hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with other music fans who understand what it means to lose a legend. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories about the people and moments that shaped the music we love. In the comments below, tell us about your favorite Ozzy Osbourne or Black Sabbath memory. Let's celebrate the life and legacy of the Prince of Darkness together, and remember that even in the darkest music, there can be incredible light and love.